Vampire myths have haunted human imagination for centuries, with origins rooted in ancient folklore, misunderstood deaths, and superstition. From Eastern European legends like the Strigoi and Moroi, to the more obscure vampire-like entities in Celtic mythology, such as the Darag-Due and the Abhartach. The belief in blood-drinking undead creatures permeates global cultures. Vampires were often blamed for unexplained deaths or diseases such as tuberculosis, which led to widespread fear and drastic measures to prevent or destroy these beings. Communities across Europe, especially in regions like Romania and Serbia, practiced ritualistic burial techniques, including staking, decapitation, and even burning bodies to ensure the dead stayed buried. Over time, the discovery of vampire bats added a new layer to these myths, enhancing the vampire's association with blood-feeding nocturnal creatures. Vampire legends reflect humanity's deep-seated fears of death, disease, and the supernatural, resulting in some of history's most macabre rituals to combat these imagined threats. Empusa and Lamia are two female figures from ancient Greek mythology that have connections to later vampire myths, as they share similar traits such as blood drinking, nocturnal predation, and preying on humans, particularly the young. Empusa was believed to wander the earth at night, preying on humans. Empusa is often described as a shapeshifter. She could take on many forms, but her most common depiction was a monstrous creature with one leg of bronze and one leg of a donkey. In some versions she had a fiery appearance, or could transform into a beautiful woman to seduce her victims. Empusa would lure men, especially young ones, with her beauty, seduce them, and then feast on their blood and flesh. Her vampiric tendencies, particularly her need to consume human flesh or blood, connect her to the later vampire myths. Empusa was part of a broader class of night-dwelling creatures in Greek mythology, including other blood-drinking monsters. Her association with the night and her bloodthirsty nature prefigure the characteristics of vampires in later Western folklore. Lamia was originally a beautiful queen of Libya in Greek mythology. According to myth, she had an affair with Zeus, and in a fit of jealousy, Hera, Zeus's wife, cursed Lamia by killing her children. In some versions, Hera turned Lamia into a monster, while in others the grief and rage from the loss of her children drove her to madness. After her children's death, Lamia was transformed into a grotesque serpent-like creature. She was cursed with an insatiable hunger for the blood of children, which led her to become a child-eating demon. Lamia is often depicted as part woman, part serpent, similar to a snake from the waist down. In some myths she retained her beauty above the waist, using her charm to lure victims, but her monstrous nature was revealed during her attacks. Like Empusa, Lamia would seduce men and devour them, but her primary targets were children. She was believed to sneak into homes at night and drink the blood of sleeping children, which is a clear parallel to the behavior of vampires in later folklore. Lamia's need to drink the blood of the young and her nocturnal habits align with the archetype of vampires, especially in their early European incarnations, where vampires were often depicted as preying on the vulnerable, including children. Both Empusa and Lamia share several characteristics that influenced the later development of vampire myths. Like vampires, Empusa and Lamia are predators who feed on human blood and flesh, particularly targeting the young and the unsuspecting. This life-draining behavior is a hallmark of vampire lore across cultures. Both figures are associated with the night, a common theme in vampire stories. Vampires like Empusa and Lamia are often believed to be most active during the night, attacking their victims when they are most vulnerable. The theme of seduction and the use of beauty to lure victims, seen in both Empusa and Lamia, is a common trope in vampire mythology, particularly in later literary representations of vampires as seductive aristocratic figures like Dracula. Both figures possessed shape-shifting abilities. Empusa could transform into various forms to deceive her victims, a characteristic later attributed to vampires, who could often turn into bats, wolves, or mist in different mythologies. While vampires as we know them today, undead beings who drink blood to survive, developed primarily in Eastern European folklore during the Middle Ages, characters like Empusa and Lamia are early examples of similar concepts in ancient mythology. Their blood-drinking nocturnal habits and predation on humans contributed to the development of the vampire archetype in later European and Western traditions. The Abhartach is a fascinating figure from Irish mythology, who is often considered one of the earliest vampire-like beings in Celtic lore. The legend goes that the Abhartach was a cruel and malevolent ruler, feared and despised by his people. Eventually, the locals grew tired of his brutality and sought a way to rid themselves of him. A warrior was enlisted to kill the Abhartach, which he successfully did, burying the body standing upright, a traditional way to honor a chieftain. However, the next day the Abhartach rose from the grave, even more powerful than before. Upon his return, he demanded blood from his subjects, either as a tribute or for sustenance. This behavior is where his link to vampire mythology becomes evident. The Abhartach's need for blood, like later vampire figures, hints at a parasitic existence reliant on the life force of others. The people, horrified, once again sought out the hero to kill the Abhartach. This time he killed and buried him again, but the Abhartach rose once more, demanding blood. After repeated failures to keep the Abhartach in the grave, the hero consulted a wise druid about how to deal with the creature. The sage revealed that the Abhartach was no ordinary man, but rather a type of undead being. To defeat him, the warrior needed to slay him with a sword made of yew wood, a tree associated with both life and death in Celtic mythology. Then bury him upside down to confuse his spirit. Finally, to cover the grave with heavy stones and sprinkle it with thorn bushes to prevent him from rising again. The hero followed this advice, and the Abhartach finally remained in his grave, unable to terrorize his people any longer. Like traditional vampires, the Abhartach is described as rising from the grave to demand the blood of the living, which is one of the defining characteristics of vampires. The Abhartach's repeated resurrection from death aligns with the concept of revenants, or the undead, central to vampire lore. The need to use specific rituals such as using wood, upside-down burial, and heavy stones to permanently subdue him echoes the traditional methods people used to protect themselves from vampires, such as staking and decapitation. The Darag-Due holds a significant place in Irish myth as a female vampire who preys on men by draining their blood. The Darag-Due was originally a beautiful young woman. She fell deeply in love with a local peasant man. However, her father, being more concerned with wealth and status, forced her into an arranged marriage with a cruel and abusive chieftain. Trapped in an abusive marriage and denied the love of her life, the young woman was tormented by her husband. She was eventually driven to despair and died, some say from a broken heart, while others claim she took her own life. After her death, she was buried in a grave near Strongbow's Tree, a location that is still said to be haunted by her spirit. However, she did not rest in peace. Consumed by anger and vengeance, she rose from the grave as the Darag-Due, a vampire-like creature who sought revenge on the men who wronged her, particularly her father and husband. The Darag-Due would use her beauty and charm to lure men to her grave or a secluded area. Once they were ensnared by her allure, she would drain their blood, feeding her supernatural thirst and taking revenge. The Darag-Due is primarily known for using her physical beauty to attract men, much like the succubus or other vampiric seductresses in mythologies around the world. Her power to entrance and mesmerize her victims is key to her hunting method. Like most vampire myths, the Darag-Due survives by draining the blood of her victims. Her need for blood is not just about survival, but also a form of vengeance against the men who wronged her in life. In Irish lore, the Darag-Due can be subdued in her grave. To prevent her from rising, locals are said to place stones on her grave or build a cairn to keep her buried. This echoes the belief in other cultures that vampires or the undead could be restrained by physical barriers, often involving heavy stones or earth. The Darag-Due is an early example of a vampiric figure in Irish mythology, with a tragic origin and a thirst for blood as a form of vengeance. Her story combines themes of betrayal, beauty, and revenge. The strongest vampire folklore comes from regions like Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Hungary. These beliefs were tied to the fear of revenants, who were the undead who returned from the grave. Vampires were often blamed for plagues, crop failures, or unexpected deaths in communities. The Strigoi and Moroi are supernatural beings from Romanian folklore that have strong connections to the modern concept of vampires. Both of these creatures are part of a rich tradition of Romanian mythology, with characteristics that directly influence the later development of vampire myths, particularly in Eastern Europe. The word Strigoi comes from the Romanian striga, which means to scream or shriek, and is also related to the Latin word strix, a bird associated with witchcraft in the night. In Romanian folklore, Strigoi are restless spirits, or undead beings that rise from their graves to torment the living, often through blood drinking. Living Strigoi are human witches or sorcerers believed to have magical abilities, such as shape-shifting, causing harm to people, or turning into animals like wolves or owls. They could transform into undead Strigoi after death if they continued to engage in evil practices. Dead Strigoi are more akin to the modern vampire. They are reanimated corpses that come out of their graves at night to drink the blood of the living, especially their relatives or those they held grudges against in life. They can also cause diseases, kill livestock, and wreak havoc in their communities. Strigoi are often described as undead creatures that retain some human form but have supernatural abilities, such as the power to become invisible, shapeshift, and feed on human blood. They are particularly active at night and target their families or neighbours. The Moroi are another figure from Romanian folklore, though they are somewhat distinct from the Strigoi. The term Moroi may come from the Old Slavic mora, meaning nightmare or evil spirit, or moro, meaning death. Moroi are typically depicted as spirits or revenants, similar to Strigoi, but they have more specific connotations involving the undead. Living Moroi are often seen as human children born of a Strigoi parent, or in some traditions, as children who are born dead or cursed. They are believed to be living beings with vampiric tendencies and magical abilities. Dead Moroi are more commonly described as the ghosts or spirits of the dead, usually linked to children who died unbaptized. Like the Strigoi, they are associated with nighttime hauntings and feeding on the life force or blood of the living. Moroi are often linked to the idea of a child or spirit returning from the dead to drain energy or blood from their families. They are sometimes said to control other vampires or undead creatures. Both Strigoi and Moroi are often described as the undead spirits or reanimated corpses that return from the grave to harm the living. This mirrors the central vampire trait of being a dead person who rises from the grave. The Strigoi in particular are infamous for their need to drink the blood of the living to sustain themselves. This is the defining characteristic of the vampire, which became prominent in Eastern European and later Western vampire lore. Both Strigoi and Moroi are creatures of the night, active after sunset and hiding during the day. This aligns with the common vampire trope of avoiding sunlight and only emerging to hunt under the cover of darkness. Like vampires, Strigoi are often described as possessing the ability to shapeshift into animals, often wolves, birds, or cats, or to become invisible, traits that are frequently found in vampire lore. To prevent or stop a Strigoi or Moroi, Romanian villagers would perform a range of rituals, including driving a stake through the heart, burning the body, or burying it face down to trap the spirit. These practices became essential parts of vampire hunting lore in later European stories. Strigoi are often believed to target their families or those they had connections with in life, seeking revenge or fulfillment of unfinished business. This personal connection with their victims echoes the vampire's traditional ability to influence or torment those they knew in life. The 18th century vampire hysteria in Europe, especially in Romania and the Balkans, was heavily influenced by these local beliefs. Stories of the Strigoi helped shape the vampire legends that later entered popular culture, particularly through literary works like Bram Stoker's Dracula. In summary, Strigoi and Moroi are essential figures in Romanian folklore, and they played a significant role in the development of vampire myths. Their characteristics of blood drinking, nocturnal predation, and undead existence form the foundation for much of what we recognize as the modern vampire legend. The vampire bat species was discovered in the Americas in the 16th century during the period of Spanish colonization. These bats are native to Central and South America and feed on the blood of animals and occasionally humans, typically during the night. When European explorers encountered the vampire bat, the animal's blood-drinking behavior struck a chord with existing European vampire legends, particularly because the idea of a creature that drank blood was already embedded in their folklore. As stories about vampire bats spread back to Europe, they added a more animalistic and predatory aspect to the vampire lore. The bat's nocturnal nature, blood-feeding habits, and ability to fly resonated with the idea of a terrifying, blood-sucking creature, reinforcing the mythology of vampires as predatory and supernatural beings. In traditional vampire lore, vampires often had the ability to shapeshift into various animals, including wolves, birds, and sometimes even mist. After the discovery of vampire bats, the idea of a vampire transforming into a bat became increasingly popular. Vampire hysteria during the 17 and 1800s in Europe was a widespread cultural phenomenon marked by fear, panic, and a series of gruesome rituals to prevent or combat vampires. This period, especially in Eastern Europe, saw multiple vampire-related incidents and even government investigations, reflecting how deeply rooted vampire myths were in the popular imagination. Several key factors contributed to the rise of vampire hysteria in Europe during this time. Outbreaks of diseases, particularly plague, tuberculosis, and other infectious diseases, decimated communities, leading to the mysterious deaths of multiple individuals in quick succession. Without medical explanations for how diseases spread, people often attributed these deaths to supernatural causes, such as vampires. In rural pre-Enlightenment Europe, people relied heavily on superstitions and oral folklore to explain the unknown. Vampires were seen as the undead, returning from the grave to prey on the living, typically by drinking their blood or sapping their life force. These stories often described recently deceased individuals returning to torment their families or communities, sometimes appearing in dreams or visions. The natural process of decomposition was poorly understood. When graves were exhumed, bodies that had not fully decayed, often swollen, discolored, or with blood at the mouth, were seen as evidence of vampirism. In reality, these were the results of natural biological processes post-death, but in the absence of scientific knowledge, such phenomena were interpreted as signs that the corpse was still feeding on the living. Several major cases of vampire hysteria swept through parts of Eastern and Central Europe during the 18th century. After a man named Peter Blagojevich died in a small village in Serbia, 9 other villagers died in quick succession, and others claimed to see him return from the grave. When the local authorities exhumed his body, they reportedly found it remarkably well preserved, with blood around his mouth. Believing him to be a vampire, they staked him through the heart and then burned his body, a common practice to stop vampires from returning. Another famous case from Serbia, Arnold Pal was a soldier who had allegedly been attacked by a vampire during his lifetime. He claimed to have protected himself through anti-vampire rituals, but after his death, people in his village began dying mysteriously. When Pal's grave was opened, his body was found well preserved with signs of fresh blood, leading to his being staked and burned, along with several others believed to have become vampires. This case caused such alarm that it attracted the attention of Habsburg authorities, who sent government officials to investigate. The case of Arnold Pal became widely known in Europe, fueling the vampire hysteria. A formal report was commissioned by the Austrian government to investigate vampire activity in Medvedja, Serbia. After multiple mysterious deaths, officials found corpses that appeared undecomposed and took this as proof of vampirism. They followed local tradition, staking and burning the bodies to stop the vampire attacks. As hysteria spread, many communities developed rituals to prevent suspected vampires from rising from their graves. These rituals varied depending on local beliefs. If a village suspected someone had become a vampire after death, they might exhume the corpse to check for signs of vampirism. Signs included a body that appeared too well preserved, blood around the mouth or nose, or a corpse that appeared to have grown fingernails or hair. After exhumation, people would take preventive actions like driving a wooden or iron stake through the heart or chest of the corpse. In some cultures, the stake was placed to pin the body to the ground, ensuring it could not rise from the grave. Many communities believed cutting off the head would stop the vampire from returning. In some cases, the head was buried separately from the body or placed between the legs. Suspected vampires were often burned to ash to ensure that their bodies could not regenerate or rise again. Heavy stones or other objects were placed on the grave to prevent the vampire from escaping. People would use garlic, holy relics, or iron stakes in graves to ward off vampires. Sometimes coins or stones were placed in the mouths of suspected vampires to keep them from feeding. While vampire legends were most prominent in Eastern Europe, the hysteria spread to other parts of Europe, including Germany and France, through written reports and pamphlets. The Catholic Church sometimes got involved, with priests performing exorcisms or other religious rites to put suspected vampires to rest. Gerard van Swieten, the personal physician to Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, was sent to investigate the vampire claims. His conclusion that vampires did not exist and that these beliefs were based on ignorance of medical and natural phenomena led to the Austrian government discouraging further vampire hunts. However, vampire hysteria persisted in rural areas where oral traditions and folklore continued to dominate local beliefs well into the 19th century. While the vampire panic subsided in many parts of Europe by the end of the 18th century, vampire beliefs lingered into the 19th century, particularly in rural areas. At the same time, vampires began to take on a new form in literature and popular culture, shifting from folklore to fiction. Romantic and Gothic literature began to popularize the vampire in more sophisticated forms, with John Polidori's The Vampire, 1819, marking the first vampire story in English literature. This portrayal of vampires was more aristocratic and less tied to the rural decaying corpses of folklore. This portrayal of the vampire as a high-born, alluring, yet dangerous figure was a major departure from the peasant vampires of European folklore, creating the prototype for later vampire characters. In the Romantic period, which emphasized emotion, individuality, and the sublime, writers began to explore the vampire in new ways. Vampires became not just monsters but tragic figures, often tortured by their immortality and cursed with an insatiable thirst for blood. This portrayal tied into the romantic fascination with melancholy, guilt, and the dark side of human passion. Vampires were seen as outcasts, often reflecting the romantic hero archetype, solitary, doomed, and misunderstood. The vampire myth found its true literary home in the Gothic tradition, which was deeply connected to themes of terror, death, and the supernatural. Gothic literature, known for its eerie settings, psychological complexity, and confrontation with taboo subjects, was a fertile ground for the evolution of the vampire myth. In these stories, vampires often embodied the tension between desire and dread, becoming figures that simultaneously attracted and repelled. The most famous and influential Gothic vampire novel is Bram Stoker's Dracula, which solidified the vampire's place in popular culture. Stoker's Count Dracula was not only a terrifying predator, but also a symbol of the decadence, sexuality, and corruption feared by Victorian society. Dracula's ability to mesmerize and seduce his victims, particularly women, introduced strong themes of repressed desire and sexual transgression, hallmarks of Gothic fiction. His character represented both the other and the fear of invasion, reflecting anxieties about foreign influence and moral decay during Stoker's time. Bram Stoker's Dracula is widely regarded as the most well-known and influential vampire work in literature and pop culture. As an Irishman from Dublin in the 1800s, Stoker would also have been familiar with the Darag-Due and the Abhartach from Celtic myth. Stoker spent several years researching vampires in European folklore. He based the novel on the real-life person of Dracula, Prince Vlad III of Wallachia, known as Vlad the Impaler. Vlad III, Vlad the Impaler, was a 15th century ruler of Wallachia, a region in present-day Romania. He is infamous for his brutal tactics in warfare, especially his use of impalement to punish his enemies. This method of execution, where victims were skewered on long stakes and left to die slowly, earned him the nickname the Impaler and a reputation for extreme cruelty. He was also known as Vlad Dracula, a name derived from his father, Vlad II, who was a member of the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order. In Romanian, Dracula means son of Dracul, where Dracul means dragon or devil. Stoker borrowed Vlad's surname Dracula and some aspects of his historical reputation to create the novel's central vampire character, Count Dracula. While Stoker likely didn't base the entire character on Vlad, the use of the name helped to associate the historical figure with the fictional vampire. Count Dracula is an aristocratic immortal being who preys on the blood of the living. Vlad the Impaler's historical reputation as a ruthless and violent ruler who spilled the blood of thousands contributed to his posthumous association with vampires. Over the centuries, his brutal methods, particularly the impalement of enemies, fed into the image of him as a bloodthirsty figure, and Vlad's historical figure was retroactively cast as a kind of proto-vampire. Vampires in folklore were often portrayed as monstrous, decayed, and grotesque creatures, more like zombies or revenants than the seductive figure of Count Dracula. Stoker's vampire is a nobleman, wealthy, educated, and with a hypnotic charm. Dracula is not a mindless creature, but a cunning, powerful, and charismatic being. Bram Stoker's Dracula contributed significantly to the modern vampire myth by introducing the aristocratic, seductive vampire with supernatural powers, while cementing many traditional weaknesses and adding deeper symbolic layers tied to social fears. The origins of the vampire myth are deeply rooted in ancient folklore and the fear of death, disease, and the unknown. Across cultures from the Strigoi of Romania to the Darag-Due of Ireland, vampires embodied fears of revenants, the dead who return to harm the living. As superstition and a lack of understanding of natural processes like decomposition fueled vampire hysteria, communities across Europe devised rituals to combat these undead creatures. The vampire hysteria of the 1700s, especially in Eastern Europe, reflected these fears, with communities exhuming bodies and taking gruesome precautions to prevent suspected vampires from preying on the living. As the Enlightenment spread and scientific understanding grew, belief in vampires gradually subsided, but the myth itself was far from dead. By the 19th century, vampires had begun to evolve in literature, transitioning from feared corpses rising from graves to aristocratic figures of mystery and allure. The vampire was reshaped as a sophisticated, seductive yet terrifying predator. Stoker's use of Gothic romance mixed with elements of folklore and fear of foreignness solidified the modern vampire archetype that has persisted into the present day. Over time, the vampire transformed further, becoming a symbol of eroticism, immortality, and even tragedy in popular culture. The vampires of today, whether in books, films, or television, are complex, often portrayed as both monstrous and sympathetic, reflecting modern societal concerns with power, identity, and desire. While modern vampires have strayed far from their folkloric roots, their continued evolution shows how deeply ingrained these creatures are in the human psyche, adapting to each era's fears and fantasies.